It's honestly quite a huge surprise in my eyes that a restaurant like the Chum Bucket can manage to be featured in so many seasons and episodes of Spongebob and still remain open in the show. Now, yes, I know that this is only a work of fiction and that it isn't meant to be taken seriously in any form or really in any kind of way. But really, though, the Chum Bucket, compared to the Krusty Krab, has little to nothing in offer in regards to food and the like. Well, I mean, there's chum that's offered on the menu, but anyone who's anyone doesn't need to be reminded what chum is actually made of. For those of you who don't somehow know what that stuff is, it's basically ground up fish guts in a bucket. Yeah, it's pretty disgusting to even imagine, and even grosser to look at without dry heaving. Which, in retrospect, this is actually a pretty messed up and dark concept when you think about it for a bit. I mean, this entire restaurant was created by Plankton, which sells ground up fish guts on a hamburger bun and tries to sell it to other fish. Honestly, if this isn't one of the most messed up and disgusting concepts in SpongeBob, then I don't know what is. Still though, it leaves a lot of questions as to why exactly Plankton hasn't been arrested, not to mention how in the heck his restaurant has managed to hasn't been shut down for the possible cannibalism or something like that. This is where I come in. Now, while this may not be considered a canon explanation due to reasons I'll explain later in the post, this episode that I wound up procuring was definitely an interesting one to say the least. However, it is likely that what I wound up getting might not have actually been a legitimate post, as I did get this link from an r/ask Reddit post regarding something SpongeBob related that I looked up a few months back. What it was for, I honestly don't even remember, but I'm glad that I did wind up going to it though, as it actually gave me a quick opportunity to download whatever file that the Redditor had answered whatever question with. Yeah, thinking about that now, that was probably one of the most moronic things I could have done online, but thank goodness though that it didn't give me a virus from it, otherwise I'd really be in a lot of trouble. Even so, thinking about the whole thing now, even after reviewing the footage for almost 1,000 times, I still question if this wasn't just some poor soul's attempt at trying to cash in on a possible trending article. Or maybe they just wanted to try and start up some kind of drama online by posting a link on there to begin with. Either way, I can't say I completely agree with how they went about doing it. Although in retrospect, I guess I'm no better since I did download the file to begin with. Regardless of how this person managed to get this episode, or why for that matter, one thing is for sure, this episode was very well made. If this wasn't an official episode set to release, then it certainly was a dang good remake in voice acting. Now, seeing as how what I wanted out of the way, let's actually get into the episode that you all wanted to hear about. The episode started off with the intro for the show SpongeBob SquarePants, specifically from the later season style, with the Ren and Stimpy kind of feel of animation, which in retrospect only made this entire thing all the more freaky to look at. Once the intro had concluded, the episode would then fade to show the main title of the episode, which was simply entitled The Chum Burger, on a light green and blue background with various pictures of Krabby Patties decorating the card in a zigzag motion, with a few crab legs also there for some reason. The scene would then transition to the bubble splash screen before showing the town of Bikini Bottom in all its ocean glory, before the French narrator began his usual startup introducing the scene. Ah, beautiful Bikini Bottom, a home of vast and diverse group of undersea life, with successful homes, prosperous citizens, and wonderful cuisine. There was a momentary pause from the narrator, which lasted until the scene faded out to show an outside view of the Chum Bucket for a second or two, where the entire screen began to shake profusely as Plankton's scream could be heard coming from the inside of the Chum Bucket. Well, at least some wonderful cuisine, the French narrator concluded, before the scene cut to show the inside of the actual dining area of the restaurant, completely barren and empty, as it always has been. This lasted for only a second before another loud scream coming from Plankton shook up the screen once more, before Plankton himself burst out of a pair of double doors, completely on fire. He continues to scream as he starts to comedically run literally all around the kitchen, knocking over various items in the process, even setting a few of them on fire as well. This doesn't exactly last very long until Karen, Plankton's computer wife, slowly rolls into the kitchen. "Oh, come now, Plankton, don't act so dramatic. It's not like this was your first time being set on fire," Karen said, as a small hand knocks the running Plankton inferno to the ground, before being extinguished with a fire extinguisher. Once the fog of the extinguisher had been Once the fog of the extinguisher had begun to dissipate, the scene clears up and shows a now charred and crispy Plankton shaking a bit before plopping down to his side. The camera angle then cuts to show Karen reaching down to pick Plankton up and placing him on top of her monitor screen. "So, Plankton dear," Karen began, "care to explain why you were on fire for the 6th time today?" Plankton groans a bit before finally answering, "Well, Karen, my computer wife, it's yet another failed attempt at trying to," Plankton said before being interrupted by his wife. "Let me guess, another failed attempt at trying to steal the Krabby Patty's secret formula. Like always," Karen said. Plankton's face immediately dropped from a frown to an irritated look. "No, Karen, that's not what I'm doing. In fact, I'm pretty much giving up on stealing the formula for good now," Plankton said. Karen, in response to the statement that coming from Plankton, immediately gasped and froze in her place. "Wait a minute. Plankton, you're not being serious, are you?" Karen asked, rather shocked. "Yes, I'm afraid so. I'm giving up on all that for good," Plankton admitted. "Plankton, if this is one of your scams to try and steal the secret formula, you've already attempted this kind of plan and failed, and," Karen said rather coldly before stopping when Plankton said, now more irritated at Karen's accusations, he proceeded to hop off of her and then onto the floor and then look up at her. "No, Karen, that's not what I'm doing. There is no plot, there is no plan, there is nothing. I'm done trying to steal something that I know for a fact I'll never get in my life. I've attempted for years to try and steal the secret formula, all of which have ended in failure. Like always. So why even bother anymore?" Plankton said rather seriously. Karen simply stood there, likely surprised and shocked at the admission that Plankton had said to her. "Well, I have to say, Plankton dear," Karen began, "while I'm happy that you're finally over with that little obsession of yours, that leaves me with one question." "And that is?" Plankton asked. "If you're not trying to steal the secret formula anymore, then what have you been doing this whole day?" Karen asked. "What I was trying to do, or at least attempt to do, was try and come up with my own secret formula to make my Chum burgers taste good," Plankton said. There is a hint of silence in the scene for a bit before Karen started to chuckle a bit, which got the attention of Plankton rather quickly. "What's so funny?" Plankton asked, rather annoyed. "Oh, it's nothing, Plankton. It's just that... Why exactly are you even bothering with that Chum anyway? You and I both know that nobody's going to eat that junk," Karen said. "Ugh. That's why I'm trying to come up with a new formula, Karen, so that way I can start getting more customers," Plankton said. "And how are you planning on doing that?" Karen asked. "Oh, you'll see very soon," Plankton said before letting out a small evil chuckle before the scene panned out of the Chum bucket. The bubble splash screen comes up, showing SpongeBob making his way out of his home with the Krusty Krab uniform on. He stretches his arms a bit before making his way over towards the Krusty Krab for the day. However, just as he is about to make his way over towards the front doors of the Krusty Krab, Mr. Krabs' claw immediately pulls him inside of the restaurant from the main dining area and into his office, before immediately slamming him down onto a seat near the desk. SpongeBob is rather surprised by this sudden act and was about to say something, but Mr. Krabs' claw immediately extended out to SpongeBob's mouth and proceeded to clamp it shut. "Boy, we don't need anyone hearing us. They might leave," Mr. Krabs said quietly. SpongeBob muffled a few words out of his mouth, which were rather hard to decipher, but if I had to figure out what he was saying, it may have been something like, "But Mr. Krabs, why do we need to be quiet?" Mr. Krabs then motioned for SpongeBob to go over to where that he was sitting at, to which SpongeBob walked over towards him. The scene then cut to show Mr. Krabs separating a set of blinds from a porthole window. Upon doing so, the cleared window showed a small line of customers, around 4 or 5, lined up to the chum bucket. "Sponge boy, me Bob, what do you see there?" Mr. Krabs asked. Well, by the looks of it, Mr. Krabs, I'd say that Plankton has a few customers," SpongeBob answered. "Precisely, me boy. This is a problem. Why is it that Plankton actually has any customers?" Mr. Krabs asked. SpongeBob was about to say something, but in less than a few seconds his eyes bulged out of his head in fear before jumping up and screaming, "He stole the secret formula?" Mr. Krabs, in completely calm manner, said, "Sponge boy, me Bob, I checked me safe. The formula is safe," Mr. Krabs said, which in turn calmed SpongeBob down. "But still," Mr. Krabs began, "if Plankton didn't steal me sacred formula, then how is he getting customers?" Both Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob proceeded to let out a before the scene panned over through the window and towards the chum bucket where the people were at. The camera then cut to show a series of patty-shaped chum burgers flipping into the air before landing onto a set of buns, fully dressed with lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and ketchup, before Plankton himself closed the sandwiches and threw them into a basket full of fries. The scene then cut to show a few of the customers looking rather pleased at the display that they were looking at, and soon they all pulled out their cash and handed it over to Karen's robotic hands, before being handed their baskets of food. "Hope you all enjoy your new and improved chum burgers," Plankton said, wiping away the sweat from his microscopic brow. The scene then cut to show a few of the customers taking a look at the sandwich, some even sniffing it or bouncing it on their heads in the process before immediately taking a bite. Everyone's eyes widened before they all began to stuff their faces full of the sandwiches, tearing off bit after bit of it until it was no more. Upon seeing the food completely gone, the customers, almost like in a frenzy-like state, ran up towards the counter and demanded more patties. "We need more of your delicious chum patties now, Plankton," one of the fish, aka Fred, said while throwing money at him. Okay. How many would you guys like?" Plankton asked the hungry crowd of people. "3 more, with extra fries," Fred announced, to which all the other fish there nodded aggressively, as if to agree on what they wanted. Plankton saw this and gave a really big happy smile before saying, "Coming right up." The customers then let out a hurrah before the camera cut back to show Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob looking out of a porthole window in the office. "What are we going to do, Mr. Krabs?" SpongeBob asked, rather concerned. "It's only a few customers, me boy," Mr. Krabs began. "I doubt that the nasty little gut patty from the dump bucket will actually get any more than a few customers." Once Krabs had finished up his sentence, the scene then cut to show a title card with the French narrator saying, 3 days later. The scene then cut to show the outside view of the Krusty Krab for a few moments, before quickly cutting to show the interior of the restaurant completely empty, with the sole exception of SpongeBob, who was mopping the floors, and Squidward, who was sitting down in his boat reading a magazine. Mr. Krabs then comes out of his office, all giddy and ready for the day. However, he freezes right as he walks out of his office and lays eyes on the barren place. His face is frozen in that same happy smile before his eyes fall off of his face in a comedic manner. Mr. Squidward, Sponge boy me Bob, where are all me customers?" Mr. Krabs asked, his mouth still not moving as he said those words. "All the customers went over to the chum bucket for their lunch today," Squidward answered, not taking his eyes off of the magazine that it was in his tentacles. It's then that Mr. Krabs' smiling face finally starts to fall into one of anger. He then turns towards SpongeBob before putting his eyes back on his head, and then motions for him to follow him back into his office, which the young sponge does. Upon entering the office, Mr. Krabs sits down at his desk and starts to rummage around at the side of him, before pulling out a small wooden box. Mr. Krabs, what's with the box?" SpongeBob asked as he made his way over towards one of the chairs and sat down. Mr. Krabs didn't answer at first, but instead kept on rummaging around the wooden box before pulling out a small bottle with a sheet of paper on it. SpongeBob's eye eyed the bottle for a bit before looking over at Mr. Krabs, who simply sighed and opened the bottle up. "SpongeBob,
As you can obviously see, the Krusty Krab is going through a tough time right now. The chum bucket's thriving more and more, we're losing more and more money.
Mr. Krabs said in a serious tone. I know, Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob answered.
That's why I have a plan to get the Krusty Krab back in business, me boyo,
Mr. Krabs said with a smile. And that is? SpongeBob asked, rather confused.
This piece of paper holds a detailed layout and a map of the chum bucket. What we're going to do, SpongeBob, me boy, is we're going to sneak into the chum bucket and find out Plankton's secret. And then we're gonna run them out of business.
Mr. Krabs said with a soft laugh at the end. SpongeBob looked absolutely floored at what Mr. Krabs had just suggested to him. Mr. Krabs? SpongeBob said.
Yeah, boyo?
Mr. Krabs responded.
Mr. Krabs, we can't do this,
SpongeBob blurted out. Mr. Krabs' smile dropped down into a shocked frown.
Why not?
Mr. Krabs asked his employer. Think about it for a bit, Mr. Krabs. What you're suggesting is that we go out and steal what's making Plankton successful and then run him out of business? Is that what I'm hearing? SpongeBob asked.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what we're going to do, boyo,
Mr. Krabs said. SpongeBob simply facepalmed and shook his head. Mr. Krabs, you said some really crazy stuff in the past. But are you really going to do that to Plankton? Are you really going to take it that far? I mean, look, I know you guys are enemies and all, but wanting to go out of your way to steal Plankton's formula and run him out of business? That makes you one really big hypocrite, Mr. Krabs, SpongeBob said flatly. Mr. Krabs simply looked at SpongeBob, rather confused at what he had just said.
SpongeBob, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that term,
Mr. Krabs said. SpongeBob again facepalmed. Okay, I'll make it simple for you, SpongeBob began. It means that you say or do something that basically you say one thing and you do another. That's kind of what it is.
An example?
Mr. Krabs asked. SpongeBob, now visibly irritated at the stupidity of his boss before him, groaned and said, Fine, you want an example, you crustaceous cheapskate? Here you go. Imagine if someone told you not to steal something, but then they go out and steal stuff themselves. That's a hypocrite, SpongeBob explained.
Oh, I see now, boyo,
Mr. Krabs said before cutting in by saying,
Now can you run by that me again, boyo? I didn't get it.
SpongeBob's face froze in a look of complete and utter disbelief before he slammed his hands onto Mr. Krabs' desk and shouted, Maybe this will get through that thick shell of yours, Mr. Krabs. I'm not going with you to steal Plankton's formula. It's wrong. Plankton has attempted on numerous occasions to steal our formula, and when he does, you go out of your way to stop him and condemn him for his actions. But here you are, wanting to throw out everything that you believe and you kept on telling me and teaching me just to make a quick buck by stealing something that even isn't yours, SpongeBob said in a soft but firm manner. Mr. Krabs simply blinked at the tone that SpongeBob had used, before quickly getting up and snapping at SpongeBob.
Now you listen to me, boyo. I didn't ask you to do this. I'm telling you to do this with me. You and I, regardless of where you might want or you might think, are going to do this, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Do you hear me?
Mr. Krabs scolded. No, SpongeBob said flatly.
Excuse me, boyo? What did you say to me?
Mr. Krabs said, now rather angry. I said no. If you want to do this, I'm not stopping you, Mr. Krabs. But I'm not going to let you drag me into this, SpongeBob said firmly. And there's nothing that you can do to stop me. SpongeBob, after saying that, immediately began to walk to the exit of the office.
You get back here, boyo, and you're gonna help me with those plans, or so help me. I'll...
Mr. Krabs bellowed. Or what? SpongeBob said, opening the door to the office. You'll fire me? I doubt that very much, Mr. Krabs. You and I both know for a full-on fact that if you get rid of me, then this entire restaurant will go down. And I don't think you want that now, do you? Mr. Krabs was left speechless, his mouth hanging agape at what SpongeBob had told him. The scene cut back to SpongeBob, who simply said 3 final words before leaving the office. I thought not. The door then slammed shut, and the entire scene was now completely quiet, with the sole exception of a small clock ticking in the background. The scene then panned over to Mr. Krabs, who simply shook his head and plopped back down onto his seat, unfolding the map in front of him.
Bah! If SpongeBob doesn't want to help me with it, then that's fine. I can do all this by myself.
With that, the scene then transitioned once more to the bubble splash screen. The scene then cleared up, showing an outside view of the Chum bucket late at night, before cutting to show Mr. Krabs at the side of the Chum bucket with a shovel in hand.
Okay, now it's time to finally get the secret to Plankton's success, and get my customers back,
Mr. Krabs said before digging deep into the ground. Upon doing so, the scene transitioned over towards the left of the screen, showing the interior of the main dining area of the Chum bucket. About a few seconds of silence, a few of the large tiles in the restaurant were lifted up by Mr. Krabs' claws and then proceeded to be tossed aside. Once there was a large enough opening, Mr. Krabs carefully crawled into the restaurant before quickly replacing the tiles on the floor.
Now, I got to find that formula,
Mr. Krabs whispered. Mr. Krabs then proceeded to go through a good portion of the restaurant, trying to find any and all kind of hints to where Plankton's secret formula may have possibly been at. However, all he wound up finding was nothing. That is, until his search, he wound up stumbling across a small door near where the prep station was at in the kitchen. Mr. Krabs' face grew into a wide, dumb grin as he reached his claw over towards where the doorknob was at. "Jackpot!" Mr. Krabs called out loudly before opening up the door, practically jumping into it in the process. As he entered into the room, he slowly closed the door shut, leaving him in complete darkness. When he managed to find a small light switch near the door, he flipped it on. When the room was illuminated, Mr. Krabs turned around, and when he opened it up, his face fell into one of complete and utter horror and fear. The scene cut to show what Mr. Krabs was looking at, and what was shown. And what was shown was definitely disturbing. The entire room was filled with shelves of various sizes and shapes, followed by a few barrels as well. Each shelf was filled with parts of crabs in it. In one shelf, there was a set of crab claws, some worn, some fresh. Another shelf contained chunks of crab meat. Another contained eyes. Yeah, you heard me right, eyes. And the last shelf contained various other parts that even I myself couldn't really properly decipher. Mr. Krabs simply backed away in horror at what he was seeing, but not before bumping into Karen's robot body. He quickly turned around, let out a yelp, and then backed away.
What is this?"
Mr. Krabs said as he stuttered. "I'd rather you not speak so loudly, sir. My husband needs a sleep," Karen answered.
"Again, what the heck is all of this? I demand an answer,"
Mr. Krabs said, this time a bit louder. Now, Mr. Krabs, there's no reason to get angry. But to answer your question, this is what my husband and I have been working on recently to perfect his chum. Or in this case, what he secretly likes to call the crab burger," Karen answered. Mr. Krabs' eyes began to widen. Mr. Krabs' eyes began to grow very, very wide as he fell over on one of the boxes and proceeded to get wedged into it to the point where he couldn't even move. Karen simply drove over towards him in a slow manner. "You see, Mr. Krabs, it's taken the two of us years to finally get the opportunity to get this restaurant up and running. But now that we found a way to actually sell something that the customers would want, we ultimately decided to go with that as our secret formula."
You're both insane. Wait till I get the health inspector here. You'll both be sorry,
Mr. Krabs yelled again, which caused one of Karen's arms to immediately grab Mr. Krabs by the throat, silencing him. "Now, here's the deal. My husband and I may have our disagreements at times, but the love that I have for him is enough to look past those disagreements. And the fact that you would want to try and not only ruin this opportunity for him, but also risk getting him into this legal trouble is unacceptable. Karen said in a soft yet threatening manner, before slamming the crustacean down on the ground, retracting one of her hands and replacing it with the buzzsaw. "No!" Mr. Krabs screamed, where the scene cut out to show the outside of the chum bucket, with Mr. Krabs screaming all the way through. His screams went silent. And then the last thing that was heard from Karen in this episode was, "Can't have you telling anybody, can we?" The scene then cut to one final bubble splash screen before showing the Krusty Krab once more, before cutting to show SpongeBob's face planted into one of the windows, with a very worried expression on his face. "Squidward, you haven't heard from Mr. Krabs today, have you?" SpongeBob asked. "Beats me, he's usually here at this point," Squidward said, reading another magazine. I'm a bit worried about Mr. Krabs, though," SpongeBob began. "He's never late for work." I hope he's okay," SpongeBob said. The camera then slowly panned over towards the chum bucket, before slowly fading in to show the interior of the restaurant, full of customers, brimming with life, and right next to the menu, a single sign on it that read, "Now serving chum soup. Get it while they last." And with that, the episode cut out and finally ended. Looking back at that episode that I had watched, and everything that I had seen on it, I could definitely understand why this episode would have likely not ever been made. Likely chances probably wouldn't have been made by Nickelodeon, especially given the dark nature of the episode. Although in retrospect, maybe that's a little bit far-fetched because the staff and crew working on SpongeBob has done their fair share of messed up stuff that would sit there and make this episode seem like, well, nothing, but still, I mean, it was really dark. Then again, I mean, even now as I think about it, despite my own skepticism regarding this episode, it definitely could have easily played out as an episode, that's for sure. But honestly though, I still wonder to this very day what exactly the Redditor was trying to pull, or if there was something that this person was trying to tell us by sending us this episode. Why was it made, and who in the world made it? These are questions that I don't think I'm ever going to know. And with all due honesty, until somebody looks into it, I don't think any of us are going to find an answer. In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping, horror-driven, nightmarish, gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.